The last session of this year, that presupposes that the year ends in December and begins in January. Has that always been the case? Well, you gave me the great segue. What was the first month of the year in the Roman calendar? Well, here's how we can figure it out. September, October, November, December, right? Consider the prefixes. S-E-P-T, a musical work which is a septet, is written for how many instruments? Seven. October, how about an octave, right? November, the N-O begins the prefix for 9. That's why a 90-year-old is a nonagenarian. Great word, nonagenarian. And December, D-E-C, decimal, right, decade, so that was the 10th month. So if September, October, November, December are the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months of a 12-month year, what's the first month? March. And indeed, that's the first month of the old Roman calendar. Of course, it was reformed several times and continues to be the subject of conversation. Why start a year in March? The vernal equinox. And going back 2,000 years, what was the date of the vernal equinox? Before you say March 21st or March 22nd or March 20th, which is the contemporary answer, remember the question is going back 2,000 years. We have the precession of the equinoxes, these dates change a little bit, and then on top of everything else, the calendars get reformed. Well, Ides are the 15th. That was a very bad day for Julius Caesar. So it was March 25th. I remember when I was in my college astronomy class. I was a freshman in college, and I learned that the Roman year began on March 25th. And a whole series of dots got connected right at that point. Because if the vernal equinox was March 25th, what was the date of the summer solstice? June 25th. What was the date of the autumnal equinox? You see where I'm going. What was the date of the autumnal equinox? September 25th. What was the date of the winter solstice? December 25th, which gets us closer to our subject. Now, before we get to Christmas, though, we have to get to Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is 164 years older than the Christian system of reckoning that was first proposed 5 centuries after the beginning of Christianity. But Hanukkah came first. Today I want to introduce the holiday of Hanukkah in a fairly general term, and then I want to propose a hypothesis about what is the hidden connection between Hanukkah and Christmas. Now, it's not the overt connection. The overt connection between Hanukkah and Christmas is found in places like the Lynn Haven Mall and the MacArthur Mall, right? And it's about cha-ching, cha-ching. That's the overt connection between Hanukkah and Christmas, which may not have so much to do with the spiritual aspect of either one. Although perhaps the spirit of giving does have a way back to it, but that's another talk for another day. So with Hanukkah, we move into the post-biblical era for Judaism. Obviously, the books that make up the New Testament will yet be created in the centuries that follow. But from a Hebrew Testament perspective, by the time you get to Hanukkah, the Testament is concluded. the great narrative of the scribe Ezra bringing the completed Pentateuch from Babylon to the Jerusalem Jewish community and reading it. By the way, do you know what gate of the city under Governor Nehemiah the scribe Ezra chose for reading the Bible to the people? Those who remember President Nixon will enjoy this. The Watergate. The Watergate. Perhaps also of contemporary interest. So that goes back already to the mid-400s before the Common Era. So Hanukkah is 3 centuries into what in Jewish reckoning is a post-biblical era. That's important in many different ways. For individuals, for civilizations, for cultures, and for religious faith communities, there are formative eras, as it were, the era where they were growing to maturity. And then there are post-classical eras, where, to be sure, they continue to develop. And yet, they develop along parameters that have been largely, not totally, but largely dictated by their own classical forebears. And that's true of schools of thought in general. So, to understand Hanukkah, we should recognize that it is the first post-classical Jewish holiday. And there are not many others, but this one, it's in a new category. I can put the question in another way. On whose authority, traditionally, on whose authority do Jews celebrate Passover? You know the answer. You just don't want to be wrong. God. On whose authority do Jews celebrate Tabernacle? God. On whose authority do Jews observe the annual Day of Atonement? God. All the Pentateuchally instituted festivals are, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, right? That's how a biblical holiday gets commanded. Not so with Hanukkah, because it's not a biblical holiday. Granted, it is found in the Gospels, because by then it had entered the Jewish world. But we're going back a century and 2/3 before that to understand the inception of Hanukkah, because in Jewish terms, how do you create a holiday if God isn't commanding it? That's not a small problem. If every other holiday known to the religion had been justified, had been warranted by being understood to have been commanded by God, but not Hanukkah. So I want us to feel a little bit of the anomaly of Hanukkah. I promise you won't get that in Lynn Haven Mall. But I hope that you're going to get it here. A sense of the... I got nothing against Lynn Haven Mall before, nor did they pay me to give them product placement. There are a number of sources that tell us about Hanukkah. Some of them are close to the original events, some of them are much farther away. The most famous one is the furthest away, and it is of the least historical value. But it's a lovely legend, so I'll give it to you, and then I'll explain why it differs from the more historically centered one. The most famous account of Hanukkah is found in the Babylonian Talmud, in the tractate that in general deals with the laws of the Sabbath. But because part of the laws of the Sabbath involve kindling lamps as the sun is going down on the 6th day, we kindle a lamp so that our home won't be dark on the eve of the Sabbath, because the night of the Sabbath, because the Sabbath should be a time of rejoicing. The prophet Isaiah says, "You shall call the Sabbath a delight." And that is very much part of the Jewish understanding of the Sabbath. It should be a time of delight. Has anyone been to Monticello? I dare say most people. Remember the floor-to-ceiling windows? Next question. Are some of you, as I am, devotees of the Tuesday afternoon Thomas Jefferson hour? Okay. So I remember in one of those shows, Clay Jenkinson, Mr. Jefferson himself, if anyone doesn't believe in incarnation, you got to watch the Jefferson hour. So Mr. Jefferson was giving a tour of Monticello. And someone asked him, I noticed these floor-to-ceiling windows. It must be terribly cold. Weren't you concerned about heat conservation? And Mr. Jefferson answered, we had woodlots outside the house throughout the property. We planted trees and we cut them down regularly, and we lit fires. There are fireplaces in almost every room. And heating a room was not difficult for us. Illuminating a room was difficult. So floor-to-ceiling windows are there to maximize the daylight. Interesting thought. Most people, early to bed, early to rise, most people couldn't afford to light their homes well after dark. The rabbinic institution of Sabbath lamps, in Europe it became Sabbath candles, and many of you have seen Sabbath candles. Lots of people's grandmas brought their brass candlesticks over from Europe, and many people in my generation have those as treasured, family inheritances. But before there were candlesticks, there were lamps, and in Israel, specifically olive oil lamps. So in the second chapter of the Babylonian Talmud tractate Sabbath, it says, what oils are fit for kindling the Sabbath lamp? The rabbis were that kind of detailed approach to these things. They wanted to get it right in all. They really believed God is in the details. So in the midst of that whole conversation, they then segue to the oil for the lamp that's used for Hanukkah. And that's how the discussion of Hanukkah is found in a tractate that deals with the Sabbath. So on page 21 of the Babylonian tractate Shabbat, the Sabbath, it says, what's the meaning of Hanukkah? And we find the following legend, which has become part of common lore. The Maccabees finished defeating the Syrian Greeks on the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, which is approximately December. I say approximately because the Hebrew month begins with the first appearance of the moon after the dark of the moon. And that can happen at any time on the Gregorian calendar, but that's the first. By the way, it's also the first of the ancient Greek months, first of the Attic calendar months. Until Julius Caesar's calendar reformation, that was the common way of beginning a month. So on the 25th day of Kislev, the Maccabees rested. The word Hanukkah, you know from the Hebrew of Psalm number 30, a psalm of David for the dedication of the temple, which is a strange superscription because King David died before the temple was built. That's 2 Samuel chapter 7. No, David, you're not going to build a house for me. God says, I'm going to build a house for you, meaning your dynasty. No, so who owes who a favor? God does not owe David a favor. That's the point of that. So it's strange that we have a psalm that David wrote for the dedication of the house that he didn't build, unless that was his response. I don't get to build a house, but I get to write the soundtrack for the movie that's going to finally show. So the word Hanukkah means dedication, but the rabbis indulged in some creative etymology here, and the word Hanu, not Hanukkah, but Hanu, means they rested, they encamped, they stopped moving. And Kaf He is the Hebrew number 25. So they rested on the 25th, which is certainly not what the word Hanukkah meant originally. But in the legend, they rested on the 25th, they went to the temple. The Greeks had, by the way, when I say Greeks, I don't mean from the mainland of Greece, I mean the Greek-speaking Seleucid dynasty, one of the successor states of Alexander the Great's empire headquartered in Syria. That was the state that controlled the land of Israel at the time of the original Hanukkah. So we call them the Greeks. So at the time that the Maccabees, who are by the way, the word Maccabee, anyone ever see, I won't mention the name because there might be other attorneys here. Blank, blank, the Hammer.
Yeah.
Or if you will, Charles Martel, the Frankish warlord, right? Charles the Hammer. Maccabee means hammer. So Judah the Hammer means his prowess as a fighter. That's where the word Maccabee comes from. So on the 25th of Kislev, the Maccabees and their soldiers rested from fighting. They entered the temple. It was all disheveled, and they could not find any undefiled oil for lighting the the temple lampstand. They found one tiny little cruse of oil which still had its original seal with the high priest's signet on it, and so they lit it. It was going to take 8 days to send out, to produce the fresh oil, to bring it back to Jerusalem, and a great miracle happened. The 1 day's worth of oil lasted for 8 days. I myself have given many sermons on that point. From a little you can make a lot, right? Imagine if you have to explain this to your teenagers or younger. Imagine that you're down to 10%. But yet the phone lasts for 8 days. That's how they'll understand it. That's the legend. Even in the Middle Ages, rabbis were a little iffy on that. One particularly clever rabbi said, well, that should justify a 7-day holiday, not an 8-day holiday, because there was enough oil for 1 day, so the miraculous aspect is 8 minus 1 is 7. We should have a 7-day holiday. A question which shows you that even then they recognize that there's something that's more legendary than historical in this. So it's a lovely story, and as I say, there's a lot of sermonic value in it, but let's try and go to earlier sources to understand how Hanukkah as a post-biblical, post-classical holiday became part of Jewish consciousness and then Jewish practice. In the Apocrypha, we have several books of the Maccabees. The first 2 of the books of the Maccabees are valuable to us as sources for the telling of the history of Hanukkah. You may know there was a very important Jewish historian of the time of the emperors Vespasian and Titus. His name was Josephus, Flavius Josephus. He talks about Hanukkah as well, but it's not an independent source because it's clear that he's reading the first book of Maccabees. So we're left with our 2 books of the Maccabees. I'm going to read to you from the first one, which was composed a few decades after the events. It talks about one of the kings of the Seleucid dynasty. Again, this was a dynasty that started with one of Alexander the Great's generals, Seleucus, who took part of the conquests of Alexander the Great and created a state there headquartered in Syria. In that dynasty, it was typical for every Seleucus to name his firstborn son Antiochus, and every Antiochus to name his firstborn son Seleucus. Seleucus the first, Antiochus the first, Seleucus the second, and so on and so forth. So you have Antiochus the third, a very powerful ruler. He even defeated the Romans on occasion, which was not easily done. And he conquered the land of Israel from another one of the post-Alexander the Great states, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was down in Egypt. And you all know about the Ptolemies because you know their famous last ruler, Queen Cleopatra. So the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria, they're always fighting each other. Poor Israel it's like Virginia in the Civil War. It's where the armies had to traverse in order to fight each other. So lots and lots and lots of fighting in Israel. But Seleucus III conquers Israel, and the high priest goes to the imperial court to negotiate a constitution for for Jews living peaceably under the Seleucids. And they agree. And the agreement, in short, is we will render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and you will allow us to render unto God what is God's, except that they didn't use the word Caesar. What they said was the Jews will be allowed to live in accordance with their ancestral customs. They, in turn, promise to be loyal taxpayers, which is always what's important, right? Loyal taxpayers. That was the norm for every pagan conqueror of the Jews, going back to Cyrus the Great. We know this from the very beginning of the book of Ezra, that Cyrus had a tolerant policy to the Jews. I promise you that that tolerance had a quid pro quo, to use another famous word, and that was that they paid their taxes. So the first book of the Maccabees tells us that from this dynasty, where generally tolerance was the order, quote, an offshoot of this stock was that impious man, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. So how is an Antiochus a son of an Antiochus? He's supposed to be a son of a Seleucus, right? Well, it turns out that Antiochus III, his older son Seleucus, had the misfortune to die. So he went to the younger brother, Antiochus, who becomes Antiochus IV. He calls himself Epiphanes. That's a very conceited nickname. Do you know the word epiphany? I'll bet you do, right? Epiphanes. I am Antiochus to whom God has been revealed. Not too shabby. Some of his contemporaries called him Epimanes, which means the bipolar one. That's what they thought of his calling himself Epiphanes. However, it's good to be king, right? When you're king, you get to make a lot of the rules. His rule was, I want to make my state less diverse. He didn't believe in celebrating diversity. He didn't believe that in diversity there is strength. He believed that in uniformity there is strength. It's a little bit like, do you remember the evil force in the children's novel A Wrinkle in Time? Remember that? There shall not be any divergences from the norm, and that's how we'll all be strong. That was his idea. He was not the first or the last person to have that idea. There were some Jewish people in Jerusalem who felt, well, you know, he's running the show, let's get with the program. The author of the book of Maccabees doesn't like those Jews, and here's how he characterizes them. At that time, there emerged in Israel a group of renegade Jews. So the faithful, loyal author of First Maccabees calls these other ones renegades. They inveigled many by saying, quote, we should go and make an agreement with the Gentiles round about. Some of the people in their enthusiasm went to the king and received authority to introduce pagan laws and customs. They built a gymnasium in the Gentile style at Jerusalem. They removed their marks of circumcision. Ouch. Now, why was that so important? Because they wrestled in the nude. They competed in the nude. So, I mean, if you're gonna, you don't want to stick out like a sore thumb if you're going to be at the gymnasium. They repudiated the Holy Covenant. They sold themselves to evil. So what we have from this first book of Maccabees is a picture of a Jewish state in turmoil. Some of them want to continue the age-old practice of living by their traditional customs, receiving the tolerance of the state for that, and being loyal in return. Others say, well, listen, that's an impossible ideal because Antiochus IV, His Majesty, has made that impossible, so let's just give up. It goes back and forth. Antiochus gets to decide who's going to be the high priest. You can tell which camp he's going to choose as the camp for the high priest. So he does that. At one point, he seizes the golden vessels from the temple. It doesn't respect the autonomy or integrity of the Jewish temple, just as he doesn't respect the autonomy or integrity of the traditions surrounding the temple. And then finally, this is chapter 1, verse 41. The king issued an edict throughout his empire. His subjects were all to become one people and abandon their own customs. Everywhere the nations complied with the royal command, and many in Israel willingly adopted the foreign cult, sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath. Pagan altars, idols, and sacred precincts were to be established. Swine and other unclean beasts to be offered in sacrifice. This is an important note. In the book of Leviticus and the other biblical dietary codes, the pig is just as unkosher as the rock badger, as the camel, as the snake, as any of a number of other species you could mention, not less unkosher, not more unkosher. They're all unkosher. But starting with Maccabees, the swine becomes the defining case of not kosher. Nowadays, if you go into the U.S. Army, there's a lot more accommodation for the dietary needs of minorities. But it wasn't always true. I have a book about the experience of American Jews putting on the uniform and fighting on behalf of the United States during the Second World War. It was a defining moment for the Jewish people. 550,000 American Jews took up the uniform. That's a huge percentage of the total number of Jews who were there at the time, right? And when you consider military age, it's almost everyone of that cohort, almost every male of that cohort who could have joined the army did. So it shaped a whole generation. They all went to basic training, and the historian, whose name is Deborah Dash Moore, calls her book G.I. Jews. And the name of the chapter about basic training is, quote, Eating Ham for Uncle Sam. Well, nowadays you can join the military, you don't have to eat ham for Uncle Sam. But Antiochus wanted them to eat ham for Uncle Auntie. They had to, which suggests that what's going on there is a religious commandment. So in whose religion would offering the swine as a sacrificial animal be mandated? And we don't have a clear answer, but the evidence seems to point towards the cult of Dionysius. That god was venerated by sacrifices that featured prominently the sacrifice of the pig. So maybe that was the cult of Antiochus. And as you know, a pagan can have more than one deity that he's on especially good terms with. Now, on the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 145, the year 145 is of the Seleucid reckoning, and that translates to 167 before the Christian era. So 15 Kislev, the quote, abomination of desolation. We don't really know what that is, but we're sure that it's nothing good. I mean, can you imagine someone suggesting an avant-garde artistic remake of the sanctuary and actually putting something on the sacred table? And if you didn't like it, can you imagine calling it the abomination of desolation? Yeah. We promised that if you liked it, you wouldn't call it that. Right? Okay. So they set that up on the altar of the Lord. And that's the 15th of Kislev. That makes sense Jewishly because the 15th is the full moon. And Jewish holidays are typically full moon holidays. Passover, the full moon of Nisan. Tabernacles, the full moon of Tishrei, and so on and so forth. And then on the 25th day of the month, that's the important thing. The 25th day of the month, the king began offering pagan-style offerings on this altar. So we're trying to figure out why the 25th day of the month. That's the date that we get from the book of Maccabees. So we have a couple of options. In In pagan society, people celebrated not a birthday once a year, but a month-iversary. The day of the month on which they were born, that they celebrated once a month. Pretty neat. I don't know if most people could afford that, but if you're a king, I'm sure you can afford that. So it's possible that he was born on the 25th day of whatever month he was born in. Or it's possible that he's tying into the equinox, solstice calendar that I began with. So the month that is roughly equivalent to December in the old Greek calendar, which may well have been Antiochus's calendar, was the month of Poseidon. In other words, the month dedicated to that particular Greek god. So perhaps what's going on is that on the month of Poseidon, when you get to the date which is also the winter solstice, they have a winter solstice festival, and that's what he's doing. Or another option is well known to us from the Roman evidence, but also from the Greek evidence, that the god in question is Saturn, because Saturnalia takes place basically from December 17th through December 23rd. And then they wanted to have an after party. So they took the following 8 days, which were the lead up to January 1st. By the way, the first day of any month in the Roman calendar is called the kalend, which is where the word calendar comes from. Kalend in the Greek spelling. So they counted down the 8th day before the kalend of January, the 7th day, and they went from December 24th to December 31st. So the whole half-month period from December 17th till December 31st is all the holiday season. When my son lived in Dublin, I went to visit him there, and I saw that indeed, although they're Roman Catholic, they're not pagan, but that notion endures, because the whole country is shutting down from around December 17th on. And it continues that way. But for them, it continues all the way until Epiphany. So they really have a good long holiday season. So we're not sure which pagan festival Antiochus was specifically copying, but it seems that we have the field right. And it's one or another or several of these pagan festivals which privilege the winter solstice. And that's where December 25th, or Kislev 25th, or Poseidon 25th comes in. Now, I'm going to skip to chapter 4 of 1 Maccabees. And we've gone through several chapters of military history. Judah wins this engagement, he half wins that engagement. Finally, he wins a big engagement which opens up the road to Jerusalem. And we're going to pick up our reading where Judah and company are now in control of the Temple Mount. They don't control all of Jerusalem. There's still a Greek garrison there, but they can contain that force and they can actually do something on the Temple Mount. This is chapter 4, verse 36 and following. Judah and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been crushed, let us go up to cleanse and rededicate the temple." Rededicate, Hanukkah, dedicate. When the whole army had assembled, they went up to Mount Zion, where they found the temple laid waste, the altar desecrated, the gates burned down, the courts overgrown like a thicket, priests' rooms in ruins. So the whole place has been trashed. Their response, they tore their garments, lamented loudly, put ashes on their heads, threw themselves face downwards on the ground. They cried aloud to heaven. So we have this national mourning over the state of the temple. Then in the next several paragraphs, we have a description of how they renovated, rebuilt, and prepared the temple for its rededication. Verse 52. Early on the 25th day of the 9th month, in the month of Kislev, in the year 148, that's 164 before the Common Era, 25th day, sacrifice was offered as laid down by the law on the newly constructed altar of whole offerings. So the 25th of Kislev is when Jewish worship resumes in the Temple of Jerusalem. I'm sure you know that that temple no longer stands. It was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. It's never been rebuilt. And on the exact spot of the Temple of Jerusalem stands the Mosque of Omar, which is why it's not likely to be rebuilt any pre-Messianic time soon. So on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, the altar is rededicated by being used again. The next verse, I think, gives us the key to understanding what's going on. This is verse 54. On the anniversary of the day of its desecration by the Gentiles, on that very day, it was dedicated with hymns of thanksgiving to the music of harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people prostrated themselves in worship and gave praise to heaven for prospering their cause. So why is Hanukkah the 25th day of Kislev? Because that was the day chosen to rededicate the temple. Why was that day the day chosen to rededicate the temple? Because that was the day on which Antiochus, 3 years earlier, had inaugurated it as a pagan shrine. So they were, as it were, undoing the damage. They were symbolically undoing the damage by taking that same day and turning it into a day of rejoicing. Is there a biblical warrant for that? Yes, there is. If you look at the 9th chapter of the book of Esther, you see that the very same day that Haman and company had planned to make the day of the massacre of the Jews was the day on which the Jewish people successfully defended themselves in the Persian Empire, and they transformed that from a day of mourning into a day of rejoicing. And then, as chapter 9 of Esther goes on, they declared that that should be a holiday ever after. Now, in that case, it was Queen Esther and the counselor Mordecai who did it. So it may have been as it were, a civil holiday for Jews who were loyal subjects of the Persian Empire. Here, Judah Maccabee is not a king of Israel. So they somehow still have to find a way to make it an authorized holiday. But why should it be 8 days? To go back to an earlier question. They celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days. It doesn't say why in 1 Maccabees, and they tell us how they did it. But there's a detail which is important. There was rejoicing as they brought whole offerings and shared offerings and thank you offerings. They decorated the front of the temple with garlands. They renovated the gates, etc., etc. And then the whole congregation of Israel decreed that at the same season each year, the dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning on the 25th day of Kislev. So the authorization is what we call in Latin the consensus omnium. You know how sometimes at a board meeting you adopt something by unanimous consent. You don't bother to take a vote in that way. So the holiday of Hanukkah was instituted by the unanimous consent of the Jewish people. Interesting legal theory. How to get a holiday started if you can't say, I heard God tell me we need that holiday. But the first book of Maccabees doesn't tell us why 8 days. The second book of Maccabees does, and I'll go faster here. I won't read every verse, but when it gets to that part of the narrative, it says, they remembered that only recently at the Festival of Tabernacles, which is an 8-day festival, they had not been able to celebrate the holiday properly because they were living as fugitives in caves. And so they dedicated the temple with a procession bearing palm fronds and wreathed wands. So you know about the use of palms in Christian religious pageantry. In the Festival of Tabernacle, palm fronds are one of the 4 species that are mandated. The other 3 are the citron, which is like a lemon, the myrtle, and the willow. So what we have in the second book of Maccabees is a description that they're having a makeup holiday for tabernacles. In fact, in the very beginning of 2nd Maccabees, which is a letter written by the author to someone else, he's commending that the Jews of Egypt should do what the Jews of Israel are already doing, which is to celebrate, quote unquote, the Tabernacles Festival of Kislev. So Hanukkah was thought of as the makeup day, the makeup week for tabernacles, and that's why it's 8 days. So that's the history of it. The history is that it celebrates a military victory, which at the same time was a successful reassertion of the right of Jews to live as Jews. So you have the religious freedom and the military victory coupled. With that understanding, we know how the legend later on got to be so important. The legend dates to the time after the Romans had destroyed the temple. Moreover, when the Jews revolted against the Romans, two generations after the destruction of the temple, this was during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, the massacre of the Jewish residents of Israel was so terrible as to be approaching a Holocaust in its dimensions. The rabbis who had emerged by the middle of the 2nd century as a leadership force in the Jewish people counseled them not to engage in military revolts because it would be hopeless. God will get rid of the Romans in God's good time. We're not going to be able to do that. So the meaning of Hanukkah had become problematized. Hanukkah as a successful traditional example of a revolt of the few against the many, the weak against the strong, the pure against the impure, the faithful against the faithless, who were crowned with success by God's intervention. That becomes dangerous if we want to invoke it as a precedent. So it became important for the rabbis to inculcate a pacifist understanding of the meaning of Hanukkah. So instead of being a call to military revolt, it became a call to quietistic spiritual revolt. Don't take up arms against Rome, but keep the lamp burning. Right? Make sure that your wicks are trimmed and that your lamp is burning. Because if you can at least prevent the darkness of what the Roman rule means, then in God's good time there'll be fuller light. So think about this. The Hanukkah lamps are kindled as the sun sets. They're supposed to push back against the darkness. Only, to quote from the prophet Malachi, it's in God's good time that there'll be the sun of righteousness, S-U-N, of righteousness. We don't know when that day is going to come. What we know is that we can keep the darkness at bay right now. So that became the later and the spiritualized interpretation of Hanukkah, which it remained, until today. Now, in a couple of minutes, let's consider a Christian parallel. So now we're going to move forward, as we have, to the rabbinic times, which is after the destruction of the temple. And it's also the time of the growth of Christianity as one of the important faith communities in the Roman Empire. So there are other, what they were called Eastern religions, and we don't mean Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism. Eastern religions meant the Asia Minor and Syria and that area. There were other Eastern religions which were also popular in Rome, and the pagans didn't like them either. One of them was the religion of Mithras, where, interestingly enough, the sun, S-U-N, is worshipped, and the sun is born of a virgin, and its date of birth is December the 25th. And the holiday is the holiday of the birth of the unconquered sun. Sol Invictus. So it seems to me that what we have in Christmas is parallel to what we have in Hanukkah. In Hanukkah, we have Judah reckoning with an assault upon religious liberty done by a particular pagan ruler who chooses the date that had been selected by that pagan ruler to undo the damage. It seems to me, and obviously I'm offering this criticism from a particular vantage point, not a criticism, an evaluation, that the choosing of the date of December 25th, as opposed to January 6th or as opposed to some other date, because you don't have a date in the Gospels, nor would you expect one if you realize that in Jewish culture, your birthday was not typically celebrated. Who has a birthday in all the Hebrew Bible? The Pharaoh of Egypt, Genesis chapter 40. And how does he celebrate his birthday? He pardons the butler and he executes the baker. Wow, some birthday. I wrote that if I were the baker, I'd much rather be a baker for some king who wanted me to create a cake out of which a dancing girl could spring. But you don't get to be Pharaoh if you're not schooled in cruelty. So birthdays were not a Jewish custom. Birthdays were a Gentile custom. So you wouldn't expect a Jewish inflected author of a gospel account to have remembered the birthday of a Jewish child born at that time and in that place. You would expect that date to become a cultural desideratum later on, when Christianity had broken through the eggshell, right? And it was now in the wider world, not just the world of the Jewish community, but the world of Greco-Roman civilization. In that civilization, having a birthday meant something more. And having a birthday which was already fraught with religious significance was good too. So it seems to me that if you go back 1,800 years, 1,700 years, the choice for a Christian is to worship the sun rather than to worship the sun. The S-O-N rather than the S-U-N. But it turns out that both Judaism and Christianity, each in its own way, is responding to a particular aspect of paganism, and that too becomes one more interesting and fruitful link between the two faith communities, which I'm always happy to celebrate. Thank you.